By 1951, the middle class in the United States was enjoying booming economic prosperity, while Western Europe was well on the path to recovery. Business was good, people flowed into malls and drive-in theaters, while the New York Yankees won the World Series in front of a sellout stadium. For the West, the horrors of the beaches of Normandy had begun to fade into memory. Unfortunately, these good times were not universal to all. In the northeastern corner of Europe, the war had not yet ended. Today, we'll be looking at the Baltics, where the struggle against a foreign occupier did not stop in 1945, and would continue for another 8 years, culminating in one of the largest guerrilla wars ever fought. Shout out to the World of Tanks for sponsoring this video. We are happy to have the World of Tanks as our partner, as the game and the topics that we cover are a perfect fit. World of Tanks is a free-to-play, team-based game featuring over 550 historically accurate tanks and more than 150 million players worldwide. There is a reason why they have such a strong player base. Regular updates and new features have kept the game both fresh and exciting. The game rewards skillful gameplay and allows players to master hundreds of historically accurate mid-20th century tanks from 5 diverse vehicle types, including light, medium, and heavy tanks, as well as tank destroyers and artillery. It has a vast online presence with a dedicated community, and clans, daily missions, in-game activities, and the steady tech tree progression will have you coming back to the game for more. Give it a try and you will fall in love. New players who register to the game from our link and use the code TANKTASTIC will receive the T-127 tank, 500 gold, and 7 days premium. To help support us, click the link in the description. Today, in 2019, the Baltic countries are made up of 3 independent nations: Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. The region has always been culturally distinct from its neighbors. While Estonians are closely related to Finns, Lithuanians and Latvians share a unique cultural identity, speaking a pair of languages widely considered to be the oldest in Europe. For centuries, the Baltic region was contested between various Germanic powers to the west and the imposing Russian Empire to the east. By the 18th century, the region had come under the control of the Russian Tsars. The occupation continued until the end of the First World War, when the 3 Baltic nations took advantage of a collapsing Russian Empire to assert their independence against both the German Empire and a nascent Bolshevik state, all with the support of the Allied powers of France and England. This freedom was short-lived, however, and in 1939, the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviets and an emergent Nazi Germany divided Eastern Europe into new zones of influence. As a result, the Baltics were annexed by the Soviet Union in August of 1940 and reorganized into constituent republics within the Union. Of course, this pact didn't last, and in June of 1941, Operation Barbarossa saw the Nazis sweep into the Soviet Union, seizing large swaths of territory and occupying the Baltics in the process. Until 1944, the region would be under German domination. During this time, native Balts were torn between which side to support, while others were forced into service regardless of their preference. During their brief occupation, the Soviets had forcefully integrated the Baltic national armies into their service. A total of 50,000 Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians fought and died in Red Army uniforms. However, they were notoriously disloyal. For example, the 179th Lithuanian Rifle Corps suffered desertion rates of up to 90% while retreating from the Germans in 1941. Meanwhile, the Nazis had accrued a sizable number of Baltic fighters themselves, many of whom had been integrated into the Waffen-SS. By 1944, there were 2 Latvian SS divisions and 1 Estonian one, collectively comprising over 100,000 men. As the tide of war turned, these soldiers fought on behalf of the Führer to prevent the Red Army from retaking Baltic land. While most Baltic soldiers in German ranks were forcefully conscripted, there were a significant portion of volunteers who saw Nazi occupation as a lesser evil compared to communist rule. Even so, the German occupiers proved no less cruel than their Soviet counterparts. Anyone whose loyalty to the Reich was considered questionable was either executed or sent off to the concentration camps. This was the fate of the Lithuanian Territorial Defense Force, a band of volunteers that had fought for the Germans until their loyalty had been pushed to the limits. Overall, neither potential occupier was a particularly attractive choice to native Balts, who ultimately yearned for their own independence. Of course, the Germans were eventually repulsed back towards Berlin, and by 1944, the Soviets had managed to reimpose their control over the Baltic countries. By 1946, the so-called Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, leaving the people of the Baltics at the mercy of Joseph Stalin, who quickly proved yet again his willingness to be a brutal ruler. The General Secretary viewed his newly acquired territories as a distinctly unreliable land full of Nazi collaborators and Western sympathizers. To that regard, he ordered a harsh Sovietization policy towards the region. Deportations of native Balts to Siberia and Central Asia became the new order of the day. This policy had actually begun back in 1941, but the largest waves of forced immigration occurred in 1948, 1949, and 1951. The idea was to target natural leaders in government, economics, education, and replace them with pro-Soviet stooges. In addition, the seizure of lands allowed Russian colonists to move in and replace the native population, further pacifying this fringe territory bordering the ever-menacing West. These deportations saw entire communities torn apart and families ripped away from lands they had inhabited for centuries. Over the years, anywhere between 200,000 to 400,000 individuals were expelled. However, rather than pacifying the land like he had hoped, Stalin's impositions had provided further impetus for Baltic natives to take up arms against him. The people of the Baltics had little hope of winning a total war against the Soviet superpower, but in a region naturally dominated by boreal forests, there remained plenty of wilderness in which guerrilla fighters could hide and then strike from the shadows. The infrastructure to support such a thing had existed since the early days of the Second World War. In Lithuania, many military-aged men had fled into their country's ample woodlands to avoid German conscription, and then they armed themselves with the weapons the Nazis left behind on their hasty retreat from the Red Army in 1944. Over time, what began as a hodgepodge of disparate fugitives evolved into a large and somewhat organized resistance front as more and more souls poured into the forests to take up arms against the Soviets. These men had hope in their hearts as they had seen how Finland had managed to humiliate the Russians in the Winter War and sought to do now the same themselves. Eventually, these wilderness warriors became grouped together by the general public under a generic title, the Forest Brothers. Between 1945 and 1952, over 100,000 Lithuanians participated in the Guerrilla War, with another 40,000 joining the struggle in Latvia and 30,000 in Estonia, either as secret collaborators or active fighters. Life as a forest brother was harsh. The wilderness of Northern Europe was an unforgiving climate where the slightest slip-up would likely lead to discovery and annihilation by Soviet forces. The partisans lived mainly in underground bunkers, which could range from squalid foxholes to multi-layered complexes. Supplies were a constant problem. There was no access to proper medicine, so wounds and sickness often led to death. The partisans relied almost entirely on capturing enemy weapons to arm themselves, and they were perpetually short on ammunition. Food was scarce and had to be acquired from nearby villages, friendly to the cause, at risk of brutal reprisal if the Soviets found out. To avoid identification, fighters went by code names, usually taking after animals like fox or bear, or going by the names of long-dead bleeders in the Baltics' pagan past. The Forest Brothers never organized under any central leadership. They were loosely divided into many units of varying sizes and ethnicities. The largest units could be upwards of 800 people, while the smallest could be nothing more than a posse of 3 or 4. They were led primarily by former military men who had served in German or Soviet armies during the Second World War. Women played a large role in the resistance too, and while they occasionally fought alongside the men, they were usually deployed as messengers, carrying vital information from unit to unit. In battle, the Forrest brothers tended to avoid direct confrontations, where they would be directly outnumbered and certainly outgunned. Instead of targeting Red Army soldiers, they went after Soviet security personnel, who played a more active role in the repression of their countries. These included the forces of the NKVD and the secret police of the MGB, a precursor to the KGB. Most Forrest brothers knew that repelling the Soviets alone was impossible. Their struggle continued through the hope that the West would finally intervene. They espoused the values of the Atlantic Charter drafted by Roosevelt and Winston Churchill back in 1941, in which the United States and Great Britain had declared that all people had a right to self-determination, and no territory could be occupied against the wishes of the people concerned. Furthermore, the Soviet propaganda of the time drummed upon its citizens that the Western nations were warmongers planning on invading the motherland. This had the inadvertent effect of inspiring Baltic partisans, who hoped that a Third World War could give them the opportunity to win their independence, just as they had done at the end of the First World War. Of course, this never happened. In the early 1950s, some partisans managed to cross through Poland and into the West, where they came into contact with British and American intelligence agents. MI6 and the CIA had a vested interest in the priceless intel that these guerrillas could acquire for them while operating behind the Iron Curtain. Those intelligence agencies sent them back to their homeland with the promise of aid in return for information on the Soviets. However, the partisans were betrayed by one Kim Philby, a high-ranking MI6 agent who operated secretly as a Soviet spy. Philby exposed the Baltic partisans to Soviet intelligence, and the fighters coming home from the West found themselves returning to their deaths. All of this, combined with the Soviets' relentless efforts in undermining them through psychological warfare and espionage, spelled the beginning of the end of the Forrest brothers. By 1953, the guerrilla war in the Baltics had come more or less to a complete stop. This was the year Stalin died, and his passing brought an end to the deportations, the primary culprit of the insurgency in the first place. Many guerrilla fighters simply slipped back quietly into civilian life, returning to their homes, their farms, and their families. After an 8-year struggle, up to 40,000 Soviet collaborators, agents, and security personnel lay dead across the Baltics, while over 23,000 Forrest brothers had been killed, with nearly as many arrested. While this anti-Soviet insurgency was ultimately unsuccessful, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia would finally regain their independence in 1991, 4 decades after the war's conclusion. The people of the Baltics had kept the Forrest brothers in their social memory, and their struggle had helped keep the dream of an independent homeland alive. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss these future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and to press the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com or on Facebook at www.facebook.com/thecoldwartv. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.